Please join me in giving Dr. J. Price a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you much. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. In terms of people coming to this part of the country, I've often found that my colleagues struggle a bit. Now, if somebody's moving here from, say, Virginia, I mean, they know that it's going to be different than Virginia. It's the folks who come here from, say, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. They think, oh, I'm from the Midwest. I know what's here. And they're the ones who have the biggest challenge. So, show of hands. How many of you think of yourself as being in the Midwest? How many of you think of yourself as being on the Great Plains? How many of you think of yourself as being in the Midwest and not the Great Plains? How many of you think of yourself as being on the Great Plains and not the Midwest? Okay, so we got a few. Okay, and so those may or may not be overlapping conversations. So, who is defining the term? And a lot of times, if we look at cultural geography, where is really when, and more often than not, who? Who is making the designation and why, and what are the constituent pieces of that? So, if we look at the environment, plain simply means a big flat area. I mean, there are plains on other planets, so that is just a wide open flat space. But then we have grasslands. And the grassland is its own entity, its own creation, and so it's what's on the plain. There are different types of grasslands. National Geographic identifies two main ones, temperate and tropical. Temperate ones are here, for example. Tropical ones, obviously in Africa and Australia. In the temperate side, we have hot and cold variations. In the tropical ones, you have wet and dry variations. And they're defined, at least in one definition, grasslands have fewer than 1 tree per acre and have been described as a sea of grass. Usually get between 10 and 30 inches of rain a year, because more than that would turn the grassland into a forest, although that depends who you talk to. And then you have prairie and steppe, and well, what does that mean? Prairie comes from the French term for meadow. And there are different interpretations of that. It could be, you have grasses, but you also have the sense of forbs, wildflowers. You might have tall grass, mixed grass, and there are different interpretations on that. So whether you're looking at the savanna, whether you're looking at the pampas, you're looking at the veldt, you're looking at the steppes in Eurasia, depends on what you're looking at. And in some areas, you see plains and steppes being the same. Sometimes they're different. Sometimes prairie is included in the Great Plains. Sometimes it's not. There's tall grass prairie. There's mesic or middle prairie, and then there's short grass prairie and so forth. So who you look at depends on how you come away with this. And so you think there's a simple answer. There isn't one. But one of the things that does happen across these lands is that it's pretty easy to get around. It's pretty easy to traverse them. The steppes are certainly the land that gives us the Huns and the Scythians and the Mongols and things of that nature. Mobility is a big part of this. They're usually not really good for agriculture, so there's a sense of nomadic existence that's pretty typical on this, but also with a focus on commerce. And the animals that are related to that, grazers are going to be really part of that. Whether we're talking about bison here in North America or the viscent, there's actually a European version of bison. has its own survival story, as a matter of fact. So there are a lot of overlaps as to who you're looking at. So that doesn't always provide a useful designation. And then you start looking at this from a political designation. And that gets even more complicated. So if you think about the United States, again, starting on the East Coast, moving west. This map from the early part of the 19th century shows the great American eagle with its wings spread over the continent. I'm not so sure I'd want to be where Louisiana is, given where that's positioned on the bird, but anyway. But that sense, though, that the U.S. has just acquired the Louisiana Purchase, and what that means is that this is hinterland. Where we are right now is the back 40. This is international space, and it's on the edge of the real, quote, United States, unquote. And so beyond that is Spain, later Mexico, as well as British and Russian and other holdings. So initially, this is simply hinterland, it's borderland. This is the great American desert, as Stephen Long had once talked about it. It was the place where Native Americans were either located or placed. By the 1830s, this becomes a place where immigrant tribes are relocated, forced to relocate themselves, depending on who you're talking about. But this is where the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Wyandot, the Shawnee, the Lenape, the Delaware, and others are coming out here, along with indigenous tribes such as, of course, the Siouan-speaking people, such as the Osage and the Kaw, and the Caddoan-speaking peoples like the Pawnee and the Wichita. And so by the 1830s, this map of tribal lands defines that western border of the United States. So the United States ends at Missouri. And beyond there is, well, Indian territory, sphere of influence. And it's an international border. This is the place where the extreme reaches of Spain and Mexico meet the United States. And so Bent's Fort, located on the north bank of what they call the Arkansas River, is the Juarez, Mexico, El Paso of its day. That is, you crossed south of the Ark River, you were in Mexico. That's El Paso, 1840. And so we forget that that was in fact hinterland. In fact, the Santa Fe Trail, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary, is really that international commerce. So this area is, well, it's just out there. It's the place you get through as fast as possible. After the Mexican War of the 1840s and the settlement of the border disputes in the Pacific Northwest, things changed. So by 1850, for the first time, this part of the continent goes from being the edge of the United States to being the center of it. And that's really, when we think about the Midwest, the Great Plains, that heart of the United States, it really dates from about 1850. Because prior to that time, it's the edge, not the center. And then it gets developed in stages, and we could have a whole long conversation about surveying and meets and bounds, and and then using meridians and baselines and all that sort of thing. But the question is, what becomes now of this central area? Well, that's when there starts to become an interest in opening it up for settlement. That great American desert now seems to have a lot more promise, and the fact that it has gold in California, gold in the Rocky Mountains really emphasizes that. You'll notice here that Kansas is opened up to the Rocky Mountains. So Kansas initially extended to the Continental Divide. Pikes Peak was in Kansas, as it should be. And so with that movement to the center, what is this space? And that really becomes part of an identity question. Because prior to that time, you had the North and the South. And then you had the Northwest and the Southwest. The old Northwest, which we today would call in Indiana, Illinois, that area, was the northern edge of the United States. The Southwest meant Louisiana, Arkansas. Well, now what? And now there's this sense that there's going to be a great development here out west, but also in the center. And this really coincides with the sense that the East Coast cities are going to start fading, and the new hub of the continent, the axis around which the United States will revolve, will be in the center. And when and you start seeing this focus on what could be potentially here as the center rather than the edge. And this coincides with the heyday of what we now call the Midwest. And I really can commend James Shortridge, cultural geographer, about talking about this. And he really points out that in the middle of the 19th century, you had the East and the West. The East was divided into North and South, as we've talked about before. To the west of the Mississippi were three designations, and there were horizontal designations. There was the Northern West, the Southern West, and the Middle West. And we were the Middle West. And that also included Nebraska and so forth, but it went horizontally. It wasn't a vertical designation. And that is going to become part of this mindset that we're going to be the hub of something. And at a time when Chicago goes from being a frontier outpost on the Great Lakes to the second largest city in the country, what else could happen? And lots of communities are competing for that. So St. Louis is, Cincinnati is, number of others. Wichita certainly emphasized that. This is the map of Wichita from 1887. This is certainly more vision than what happened. This is not to scale, by the way, just in case you weren't clear on that. Because, okay, I'm sorry, but I got to do it. You have over here, here's Wichita in the hub, here's Kansas, and then here's Little Texas. Oh, there's Galveston, and St. Louis is over there, and oh, there's El Paso, and oh yeah, there's some stuff over here, and then there's Los Angeles and so forth, and it distorts that perspective. There's a great book out there called How to Lie with Maps, and so this is not to scale, it's about value. It's making a statement about the presence of a place like Wichita. So if Chicago could go from frontier to major city, why can't we? And we're going to do it because we will promote ourselves enough. And that sense of promise of what could happen guides the idea of the Middle West in the 19th century. And this then leads to a sense of the frontier. And we have to, if you're really going to get into Western history, we got to talk about this dude right here. His name is Frederick Jackson Turner. And in 1893, alongside the Chicago World's Fair, he composes an essay called The Significance of the Frontier on American History. And what he notices is that in The Significance of the Frontier, he is seeing the census and that boundary between settled and unsettled. And what he finds is that movement of settled and unsettled, more than 2 people per square mile and less than 2 people per square mile, moves. And at each census year, it moves more and more and more to the west. And in 1890, it isn't there anymore. The U.S. has been settled more or less from coast to coast. Now what? And that's not just a demographic conversation. What Turner understands is that this frontier boundary isn't just a population piece, but it's really the engine that makes the United States American, North American. This is the engine of our democracy. It's on the frontier where people shuck off the traditions of Europe and adopt Native American ways, or more resilient kind of dealing with the local needs and neighbor helping neighbor, that sort of idea, and defending each other. And that conversation is what makes our democracy work. And that engine of frontier is something he sees in the 19th century. And when it's no longer there, well, now what? And so there's a cautionary note to that. Now, this is what's called Old Western history. Today we understand that its reality was a lot more complicated than that, but in 1893 this was a different social science approach to things. We're now realizing that, for example, settlement didn't happen in these nice, neat little frontiers and with stages and so forth that he did. It's more of an out to in. For one thing, after all, California is settled before a lot of parts of the interior of the continent are. And so it's clunky, but that really, when you hear about frontiers, it really owes its origin to this guy. The other thing that we see then is this. This American development has exhibited not merely an advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line, and a new development for that area. American social development has continually been beginning over and over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society has furnished the forces dominating the American character. The true point of view of history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West. In this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Much has been written about the frontier from the point of view of border warfare and the chase, but as a field of serious study, the economist and historian, it has been neglected. So he's launching into a new way of understanding this. And you can see why he's talking about this. He's speaking within visual sight of the Chicago World's Fair. And so he's seeing the Chicago World's Fair showcasing the promise of the heartland of the United States. And so this is where we're starting to see a shift. In particular, the rise of the Great Lakes as part of the Midwest. So Shortridge again talks about the fact that the Midwest, by the turn of the century, moves from being on the Great Plains and the agricultural side to being industry-based. And now the Midwest becomes industrial as a conversation, and in particular is going to be centered around Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, and places like that. So there's already beginning to be a little bit of a shift. This is the same time, by the way, we're going to see upstart architects like Frank Lloyd Wright designing the prairie style as an American style. That's not just copying what was transported from across the sea, but is embodied in the landscape, the long, low lines of the center of the continent. And so this is in a lot of ways the heyday of the Midwest, the Middle West. This is the promise of the Middle West as an American guiding presence. Frederick Jackson Turner, by the way, doesn't just stop there. As a historian from Wisconsin, he is part of this movement to have Western historians give their voice to U.S. history. And he's one of the main figures behind what will eventually be the creation of a whole movement. This is a journal, this is from the turn of the century, the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. If you're an academic historian, you know this as the Journal of American History. It began, though, as a regional journal. And it says here, and this is in its pioneering volume in 1814, We've already asked again and again the most discordant support from local societies, state departments of history, West history departments, and universities of the Middle West. This review belongs to them, and it is believed the editors that natural good will result from the closest cooperation. The Mississippi Valley has been arbitrarily divided into the Old Northwest, the Old Southwest, the Trans-Mississippi Northwest, the Trans-Mississippi Southwest, and a number of others of review, and there will be a survey of historical activities in one of these divisions. Our readers will thus obtain a view of research that is being conducted in every part of the valley, a notable development of methods particularly emphasized. An illustration of the value of these surveys, we wish to call attention to Mr. Buck's explanation of work that is planned in the states of Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and so forth. And so it says up to the top, the Mississippi Valley Historical Review will be devoted to the promotion of the research of history of the valley, the limits of which will be considered as extending from the Appalachian to the Rocky Mountains. And attention will be given to the surrounding regions as far as they have been historically connected to westward movement. So the Mississippi River is now the hub of the continent. And we're part of that. And we're part of that in Kansas because we're part of the Mississippi and the Missouri watersheds. And so is Ohio, so is Indiana, so is the Upper South. And so you can see how they're seeing this as that heart of the United States, geographically along the Mississippi, as the axis around which we need to be looking. And this coincides in the turn of the century, and then really by the 20s and 30s with a movement known as regionalism. And I really want to thank the Wichita Art Museum for allowing me to use this image. Regionalism is an art, literary, and social movement that celebrates the regions of the United States. It emerges as an awareness and appreciation that there are unique qualities and features for the different parts of the United States. And it celebrates them. Rather than saying we're all one monolithic whole, what it's saying is that there are different areas with their own characteristics, usually based in geography and land and things like weather and so forth. And it celebrates it in artworks. Burger Sunzane and the Prairie Printmakers, very much a part of this. This is Charles Capps, talking about castles in Kansas. The grain elevator is not just a utilitarian piece, but a thing of beauty, a sculptural thing of beauty on the landscape. This is the world that gives us Willa Cather. This is the world that gives us the Harvey houses and the artwork related to that. This is the world that gives us the New Deal era artwork that celebrates the parts of the United States with their own identities. And so one facet of that is the Great Plains. And by this point, we have an entirely new conception of geography. One that isn't politically based, but geographical in orientation. And Walter Prescott Webb publishes this in the 1930s. And it defines not the horizontal or even the Great Lakes, but this vast stretch of short grass and middle grass and even tall grass that goes from Canada all the way down to Texas. And it's a vertical designation. This sea of grass defined as broad open expanses, not a whole lot of trees. Pretty dry. In fact, Webb's conception of the American West, he says the West begins not at the Mississippi River, but at the 100th meridian, which is the dry line, a point where east of it it's a lot wetter, west of it it's a lot drier. And so he sees that as the vertical dividing line. And it creates a unique culture, one that's based on portability. And the horse is really central to this. And it changes everything from the firearms, the revolver, he says, comes out of this. I mean, have you ever tried to load a muzzle loader rifle on a horse? Barbed wire, the fact you don't have trees to build fences, and it's hard to get all those there's rocks, but you need a lot more of them, and the 160 acres isn't going to do a whole lot for you in the high plains. You have to fence off vast stretches of land Barbed wire comes into that. And it's dry. You need to irrigate it. So you pump water out with windmills and things like that. All of that shapes who we are. And it comes out exactly as the Dust Bowl hits. Exactly as waves of dust sweep across the same part of the country. And it frames in a lot of ways works like Pere Lorentz's film from 1936, The Plow That Broke the Plains. The idea that overuse on the and ignoring the fact that this is a land of high winds and sun has disastrous consequences. This is also, by the way, the same era that gives us the concept of the Great Lakes. So what had been the Midwest is now the Great Plains and the Great Lakes. And that these sub-regions or regions in the United States are now the way you should be thinking about things, rather than some monolithic sense that the Middle West is America incarnate. So, from Webb, we find that a plains environment has three distinguishing characteristics: a comparative surface of great extent, a treeless land and unforested area, and it's a region where rainfall is insufficient for the ordinary extensive agriculture common to lands of a human climate. So the climate is humid. Now you have a lot of discussions also about climate areas and so forth, and zones, and those of you who are gardeners know all about that. But it's not based exactly on population or political boundaries as much as it is on, well, this is the landscape and it shapes society from there regardless of who's settling on it. In the middle of the 20th century, we have other conceptions of this region. Snowden Flora, who is one of the great commenters about weather, and is really one of the first major scholars of tornadoes, based out of, by the way, the Weather Bureau's office up in Topeka, says that Kansas lies across the path of alternate masses of warm, moist air moving north from the Gulf of Mexico and currents of cold, comparatively dry air moving from the polar regions. Consequently, its weather is subject to frequent and often sharp changes, usually of short duration. And so he sees that as the engine that drives our severe weather, and including tornadoes. In fact, the word tornado alley comes out of the 1950s. And that sense there were so many tornadoes that were being seen and talked about in the news, that in this heart of the continent, that, well, what's going on here? So now we have some other features, that this is now Tornado Alley, not just Great Plains, Midwest, and so forth. By the 50s, the regionalism world has kind of faded, and now we have a different set of identities. Here in this part of the world, we talk about Midcontinent, which actually began, you see in the naming for oil, the oil field, the Midcontinent oil field is where a lot of that comes from. But it's that center of the continent, and not just the United States, but really North America and Mexico and beyond that. The other part of it is the idea of the West. I mean, this is the heyday of the Western movie and the Lone Ranger and John Ford. And so maybe it's returning to that sense of the West and the Old West as the new iconic source of American identity. So it's not the hardy Midwestern farmer, it's not the industrial heartland of Chicago that makes America American. It's the cowboy, the ranch hand, the Chisholm Trail. And that's where that starts to come in. And so now the West becomes the model for what makes America incarnate. And so Kansas is definitely tying into that. And Old Cowtown Museum, absolutely part of that idea. Here's the Stockyards Hotel up in north part of Wichita, certainly embodying that. And so, well, we're not really Midwest, we're really either Midcontinent or we're Western as a whole. And Midwest starts becoming a challenge because it's a sense of it's Midwest nice. As one article once put it, California is the flashy blonde you like to take out once or twice, but Minnesota, in this case, is the girl you want to marry. that Midwest. It's Norman Rockwell, but it's safe, it's quiet, but it's not really all that exciting. The West is exciting. And so it's a lot more fashionable to adopt a Western identity than, say, a Midwest identity. And then in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, we have a couple of new conversations coming out as well. One of the ones that's probably of most relevance to this group here is the book on the left. A fellow by the name of Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips was a staffer for the Nixon campaign in 1968. And his book that comes out in 1969 is called The Emerging Republican Majority. And he argues that up until this point you had the Republican Party embodied in Wall Street in the Northeast versus the South, which was loyal Democrat, as well as part of that larger New Deal coalition. Well, he takes aim at that and says, what you're going to see is instead a new belt of individuals who will favor Republican politics, will favor a free market attitude, will have real criticisms and concerns about the New Deal, and they're going to extend from a wave from the Upper South all the way to California. He called it the Sun Belt. And so the Sun Belt, that term, is a political term coined by someone related to the Nixon campaign. And he said that is going to be the new core of the Republican Party. So focus on winning voters in the South, especially white voters in the South, and that will be the new core for the Republican Party. He sees, for example, the Wallace voters being potential Republicans at a time when the Republicans weren't so sure they wanted to go in that direction. So today we talk about the Sun Belt as being involved with industry, especially high tech after World War II and so forth, but the conversation really begins politically. Conversely, we have the Rust Belt. What had been the industrial heartland of the United States around the Great Lakes starts to change with globalization and policies that target other areas of the economy, as well as the rise of a service economy and so forth. So those industrial heartlands from Pittsburgh to Chicago to Detroit to Milwaukee are now fading. And Phillips says, yeah, these folks are going to, they may have been a driving factor in the electorate, and they still will be, but it's the Sun Belt. And now what had been this hub of the continent, what was going to be this great movement forward, is now feeling more and more forgotten, more and more of a backwater. If you look at the 2016 election, where was the big shift? The Old Northwest, the Rust Belt. I mean, that shift is exactly what we're talking about in something like this. And then we have other belts as well, the Bible Belt. Now, H.L. Mencken claims credit for coining the term the Bible Belt in the 1920s, but really, as we understand it as a conversation, there's no unanimous definition of it, but it really emerges in the 1970s. And it's the awareness that religion, especially evangelical religion or conservative evangelical religion, is now growing as a conversation in the country and shaping things, and it seems to be concentrated in certain areas. And so a number of scholars, James Shortridge, as a matter of fact, is one of them, are identified that Jackson, Mississippi may be called the buckle of the Bible Belt, but Oklahoma City is definitely marginal, and Kansas is not in it, he says. Others, like Stephen Tweedy, looked at religious programming in television in certain markets, and he said that there were two areas. One was a zone of the Upper South, and the other was in the Upper Plains. And so whether Kansas is in that or not depends, but it's a different conception based on political and social attitudes. By the way, if you look at Wichita, You look at religious demographics in Wichita in 1970, and look at Wichita's religious demographics in 2000, and they look like two different cities from 3 states away, not the same city over a span of 3 decades. In 1970, mainline Protestants were the bastion, along with and Catholics as well. Our Methodist, Baptist, Northern Baptist, and so forth. You look at Wichita in the 2000s, evangelicalism is a major. We look demographically more like Little Rock than we do Des Moines. And that shift is absolutely part of that. So is the Bible Belt stable? Is it moving? Is it expanding? Is it this fixed entity? And geographers really debate that. And here is the other part of it, and I think this is where things are going to tie into this group. By the 1990s, we have a new heartland. And the new heartland is the South. By the 1990s, the Midwest has faded as this engine of American identity. The West and the Old West has faded. I talk about the fact that I was 6 when Gunsmoke went off the air. And you think about how many generations, kids and so forth. Lone Ranger who? They may have heard of John Wayne. The Hopalong Cassidy, no clue who this person is. Never heard of him before. Kids don't play cowboys and Indians anymore. They may play cops or robbers or Grand Theft Auto or whatever they're playing, but they aren't playing cowboys and Indians. And so that idea of being Western doesn't have the same shtick. In fact, one of the challenges, if you look at the Western genre on TV and movies, it's actually pretty adult. It's the same people who grew up with Hopalong Cassidy in the 50s, and now they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. So Western movies today are grown up. They're not for kids. That tells you something. Meanwhile, you look at country music that takes off as a national phenomenon in the 1990s. NASCAR, founded in 1947 in Florida, still Florida, but here's a Florida conversation that's guiding American popular culture. Country music is there, but it's in a lot of ways it's not really country and Western, it's country and Southern. There's a song, and Kansas is wrapped up in this. If you look at the song She's Country by Jason Aldean, here's part of his lyrics are, hail raisin sugar, when the sun goes down, mama taught her how to rip up the town. Honey drippin' honey from a holler in Kentucky. She's got you flippin' kind of trippy like a Mississippi hippie. She's a Kansas princess. Crazy mother trucker. Undercover lover. Thick southern drawl. Sexy swingin' walk. There is all that southern imagery, but she's a Kansas princess. Or you look at political shifts in the 1990s. You look at politics in that era. You have Clinton from Arkansas. You have Newt Gingrich. Again coming out of the South. You have people like Rush Limbaugh, who was raised in Missouri. The South, linguistically, culturally, politically, is now the driving factor of the U.S. cultural conversation. So when they say the heartland, they mean the Upper South. And that's going to be a challenge as well for a lot of folks here. It's still the case. And I think this is really where you have to remember that, okay, if people are moving around, that's where the energy is. And the slightly awkwardness for a place like Kansas is there are lots of places that are American heartland now. If I am living in California and I'm sick of the left coast and I'm sick of taxation, I'm sick of the politics, I want something conservative, you can do that. Lots of parts of the country can. Why would you come to Wichita when you can move to Dallas? Why would you come to Wichita when you could move to Raleigh-Durham? And you can say, well, we're conservative. I'm sorry, good luck, folks. You cannot out-conservative Texas. Good luck trying. Your nemesis, Kansas, if you're looking at attracting a more conservative base, isn't California. It's Texas and Florida and North Carolina. And you want family values to come, you want somebody, they want you to raise your kids with the family values. That's great, Utah has them too, and they have mountains. What have you got? So you have a lot of competition. And that's going to be, I think, one of the biggest issues that Kansas is going to face in terms of recruiting, bringing people in, because there are lots of places that do what we do on a bigger scale. And so we also go back then to, how do we think of this area anyway? Maybe we don't need to use all these terms anyway. Maybe it's just a bureaucratic piece. This happens to be from the census regions, again, of the United States. The Midwest, they call it the Midwest, but they have the Northwest Central, Southwest Central, East-West Central, and so forth. So we have maybe the North Central. Do we all hang together like that? Do we hang together like this? Do we hang together like this? Who gets to do the designation and the definitions? And it depends who does the talking. And then you have people who worry that, well, how do we move forward from this? And so you have individuals who say that this is a land in decline, the old Heartland. And, well, it's nice, Midwest nice, it's nice, but it's kind of fading. You had individuals like Deb and Frank Popper in 1987 promote an idea that because things were fading, in, especially the high plains, maybe we should just turn it back over to the buffalo and make a Buffalo Commons. Didn't go over real well. They keep insisting this was just a thought experiment. They weren't actually proposing it, but it was an idea that didn't go over very well. But you have the idea of maybe we should promote tourism. The Kansas Explorers Club is certainly there. Maybe there's a nostalgia that we need to be tapping into. Prairie Earth by William Lease Teat Moon is certainly part of it. Maybe it's about the sense of energy. We are, after all, the Saudi Arabia of wind. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe the wind farms are part of it. Maybe oil and gas is really the thing that needs to be discussed. And then we have individuals who try to redefine the Midwest. John Lauck has almost single-handedly revived this. In a book called The Lost Region, or This is Finding a New Midwestern History. There is a Midwest Historical Society, again, arguing that we've lost the energy of what the Midwest, and he really thinks of it more in that upper Midwest. When he talks about Midwest, he means kind of this up here. Maybe we need to recapture that. I mean, he's the one who really talks about how Frederick Jackson Turner helped define what we understand as the Midwest today. Or maybe we're the Great Plains. We have the Certificate of Great Plains Studies, which I had at Wichita State. We could talk about that as a way of looking at it. And do they overlap? Do they not? Lots of conversations. Got a class on that coming up. And now we're starting to get a little bit more of a sense of local pride again. And I just talked to the folks at Heartlandia.com, got to give them a plug here, for creating these little logos. Here's the heart of the continent with a little heart on it. There's Midwest with the heart on it. Maybe the Midwest just needs a little more love. Maybe it needs a little more love. Maybe it's not a valid concept anymore. Maybe another concept is needed. Maybe it's just going to be an evolving concept and we're just in between identities. We don't know. But that's why then when you start looking at, well, where are we? That's not an easy question, because there are a lot of ways to do it, and it really has something to do with who you are. So with that, being mindful of time, I'm going to I can entertain a few questions.
Thank you for being our speaker today. You're a very interesting person to listen to. while you were talking, I couldn't help but think of technology being a big driving factor, and especially in the South. I want to ask you, which was a bigger change for America, the railroads or air conditioning, which focused on the South again?
Wow, okay, you're good. That's the question that you really got to be thinking about. It's technology that really is able to overcome a lot of this. Certainly the Sun Belt is made possible because of air conditioning. You could function in Arizona by train. Functioning in Arizona, my parents just moved to the Phoenix area. Yeah, you need air conditioning. It also made the Deep South a lot more habitable. So I think that's certainly part of it. Regarding highways, that actually is a lot more about where areas are developed rather than the region as a whole, I would say. So highways definitely favor bigger metropolitan areas. Certainly the hub system in aviation as well really does that. So it kind of concentrates where things were. So in the old highway system, you saw this decentralization of small towns. And now things are clustered in bigger and bigger cities, and people are moving more towards that. So I think there's that energy around cities even within the region. But a great observation. Exactly right.
Our last question.
Certainly.
And would you address agriculture a little bit? Why do certain areas grow corn, soybeans, and wheat?
Sure.
And is there a neighbor helping neighbor barn raising spirit that is more common in the Heartland?
The question about are there different agricultural regions? Absolutely. In fact, if you want to get more into some of the story of the 19th century, look at the book From Prairie to Corn Belt, which is looking at that upper Midwest a little bit more. In fact, if you look, you have the winter wheat, you have the corn belt, you have a summer wheat, you have a rice belt actually around a wild rice belt around the Great Lakes and so forth. So those areas are definitely part of it. So certain areas are a lot more conducive to certain crops than others. You have the Ogallala Aquifer underneath the western part of the plains that made irrigation even possible. If you hadn't had that, the crops wouldn't be out there, flat out. Those things are changing, though. That those boundaries are shifting between those agricultural zones. It also changes a little bit how the society works. So we were talking about this a little earlier, that there's a difference, I think, between wheat towns and corn towns. I mean, the cycles of the year are different. Grain bins versus corn bins versus grain elevators. In fact, if you're on the Kansas Nebraska border, there is a point where you see corn bins and then boom, you see grain elevators. I mean, and that is almost as defined a feature as anything else. So yeah, I think the nature of agriculture, and the agriculture has changed too. It was based once on the small family farm, the idea that there'd be these little farms all across the country. And now it's a lot more concentrated, and you don't need as many people to be on the farm to make it function anymore. And so all those small towns were designed in part because you needed all the labor. You don't need the labor anymore. So that's an issue. The other point, and a book called Caught in the Middle actually talks about this. And it's the sense that the Great Plains and the big cities, we tend to think of them as separate, but in fact they're interconnected. People aren't here farming because it's cool and fun. It's economically profitable, and it's profitable because there are markets that you can get to pretty easily. And so the cities and the farms are related to each other as much as we think of them as separate. And again, Caught in the Middle really shows how that relationship has functioned. So, good point.
Dr. J. Price.
Thank you much. Thanks, Carl. Appreciate it.